Across the European continent, many fantastic imperial powers have left their footprint on their own soil and abroad. But one European empire that tends to deserve more credit than it's often given was the mighty Empire of Sweden. The Swedish Empire is generally said to have started with the reign of Gustavus Adolphus in the early 17th century and is usually believed to have ended roughly a century later with the Great Northern War and its aftermath. This, sadly, means that the imperial might of Sweden was short-lived in comparison to other empires in the region, but nonetheless, it still existed for the reign of multiple monarchs and was far from being irrelevant in its day. So, what happened with the Swedish Empire? Was it ended by war, economic strife, poor leadership, or something else? Well, let's take a look. Throughout history, intelligence and espionage have been very important elements when one kingdom or empire tried to conquer another. Even though these old methods have disappeared, today's world has brought new possibilities to compromise our digital security through the internet. But you can protect your personal information using NordVPN. They offer you multiple benefits like internet freedom, offering 5,100 secure servers in 60 countries, protection against malware, online privacy, the ability to use up to 6 devices for one subscription, and other layers of protection. So, if you want private, fast, and secure internet access, NordVPN is for you. You can support our channel by visiting nordvpn.com/NalagiaVPN to get a great discount of the 2-year plan and 1 additional month for free with no risk to you, considering that NordVPN offers a 30-day money-back guarantee. Before the reign of Gustavus Adolphus came that of King Gustav Vasa, who would solidify his place in Swedish history through his sweeping efforts to reform the Swedish state over his 37-year rule, and would lead Sweden into its role as a prominent state in the newly incited Protestant Reformation. By the time Gustavus Adolphus claims the throne, this strong Protestant conviction in Sweden dragged the kingdom into the 30 Years' War with the Catholics of the Holy Roman Empire. It was this war that resulted in the gaining of new territory for Sweden throughout the dominion of the Holy Roman Empire and coincided with Swedish colonial efforts in both West Africa and North America, which meant a sudden increase in Sweden's global influence over only a few decades. Sweden was suddenly turning itself into an empire, and at first, it was going quite well. Problems within Imperial Sweden were not slow to arrive nevertheless. Following the reign of Gustavus Adolphus came the ill-liked rule of his daughter Christina. The new queen was a very intelligent woman, but she was also a woman who much enjoyed a bit of extravagance. Her spending was viewed by the public as unappealing and eventually became so much so that she nearly drove the state into bankruptcy. Public disapproval ultimately reached an all-time high and pushed Christina into her abdication, at which point the throne was taken over by her cousin Charles Gustav in 1654. Charles was a markedly better ruler in the eyes of the public, and they quickly looked to him to mend the state's issues, ranging from finances to relations with the people and the nobility. To solve the financial problem and tackle the whopping national debt, Charles decided to address an ongoing issue relating to alienated crown lands and taxes on the nobility in a process known as the Reduction. Meanwhile, Charles, who had been first and foremost a soldier, decided to put added effort into military action and gaining glory on behalf of himself and Sweden, which prompted mixed reactions as he decided to attack the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth early into his reign. The subsequent Polish-Sweden wars were not necessarily a failure, but they weren't quite what the nation needed. Charles's personal reputation and success grew as a result, but the warfare didn't solve Sweden's financial and political issues back home, which would continue into the reign of his successor, Charles XI. Technically, Charles XI was only 4 years old at the time of his ascension, so a regency council was put in place to actually run the empire until he came of age. During the time of his childhood, the regency council hopes to end the ongoing wars not only with Poland, but also with Russia, the electorate of Brandenburg, and their longtime rival of Denmark-Norway. In an immediate effort to do this, the Treaty of Olivia was signed in the spring of 1660 by the Swedish Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Brandenburg, Prussia to end the chronic hostilities and resolve some of the remaining territorial and political discord between the states. Encouraged by the peace talks, Denmark-Norway then opted to open their own negotiations with Sweden, and the Treaty of Copenhagen was signed shortly after. Lastly, the following year, hostilities were put to an end with the Tsardom of Russia after the Russo-Swedish War had ended in 1658, which more or less put an end to all discontent and conflict between the Swedes and their neighbors. Peace had come at a price, and a dwindling passion for upholding Protestantism within their realm was also earning the Swedes a new wave of enemies from the inside. Only about half a century into its existence, the Swedish Empire had already nearly gone bankrupt, suffered from abdication from one of its monarchs, juggled multiple wars at once, and was now struggling to build up national confidence. Sweden became notoriously corrupt, and its loyalty was buyable, something that France took quick advantage of. By 1675, France had convinced the Swedish Empire to invade the electorate of Brandenburg, which resulted in an embarrassing defeat for the Swedish army and greatly emboldened their other rivals, leading to the Scanian War. This marks the point in time where the trajectory of the Swedish Empire quickly pitched downhill. Brandenburg, Denmark, Norway, and Austria all began to capture more of Sweden's territories, and the new war went fairly poorly for the Swedes. But they were able to maintain a certain level of success militarily within their own borders, and thanks to the alliance with France, the resulting treaties restored Sweden's lost territories. Charles XI, now governing of his own accord, opted for sweeping reforms in response to the war, then shifting the empire into a semi-absolute monarchy, which actually went over quite well with the people. He was also able to rebuild the Swedish Royal Navy, which had been essentially demolished in the recent war, and used additional reforms to improve the military as a whole. It seems that the Swedish Empire would be saved, thanks to Charles XI, but his death would mark the continuation of the imperial power's rapid downhill tumble. The next king, Charles XII, would be left in a precarious position when, in 1700, Sweden's off-and-on rivals in Denmark, Norway, Russia, and Poland simultaneously declared war, and the years to follow were a bit chaotic. Poland and Denmark were in and out of the war, and Sweden did well against Russia with the help of some allies. But Russia was eventually able to capture what is modern-day Finland. Charles XII's death in battle in 1718 would mostly put an end to Sweden's defense efforts and its time as a global power. Now, Sweden remained a relevant regional authority, but its time as an empire was all but over, despite the dedicated efforts from Charles XII and his father to save their imperial state. Unfortunately for the Swedes, the empire never had a strong foundation. Its early years were respectable enough, but the reign of Christina brought in fresh skepticism and distrust from the people, massive financial burdens, and the early inklings of governmental corruption. Her abdication was good in the short term, but set an unsavory tone in the long run as it marked the shortcomings so early into the empire's existence. Her successor was an improvement, and surely a brave soldier, but not enough was accomplished by him to make up for the damage she had done. Over the next few reigns, a common thread of disorganization, instability, and a growing list of enemies made it incredibly challenging for Sweden to make any significant progress. War was financially taxing and worked to isolate the young empire, which pushed Sweden from one issue to another, whether it be internal conflict over which war should and shouldn't be fought, or the growing displeasure from the people due to the corruption and willingness by the government to be bought as an ally to those who would take them. Still, the last two kings put in a fair effort to save their crumbling empire, but it ultimately would not be enough. The momentum had already begun and was impossible to stop. So, the reason why the Swedish Empire quietly collapsed after a short century is due both to external pressures, but also, and maybe more importantly, due to internal instability and a shaky foundation from the beginning. Unfortunate circumstances combined with just as unfortunate decisions led to the empire never having a chance to get its head on straight and eventually brought about its untimely demise.